Why did he stop just to watch her hands? The armory was silent, the kind of silence that seemed to carry its own weight. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, dust motes drifting like tiny satellites in the still air. At the workbench, Sarah Martinez leaned over the disassembled Barrett .50 caliber, her hands moving with mechanical precision and something more reverence. Every movement was deliberate, clean, sure. She never rushed, not when the weapon in front of her could decide whether a soldier went home in a coffin or walked back under the sun. Sarah's slender fingers, smudged faintly with oil, worked the chamber rod through the barrel. The sound was faint, steady. To anyone else, it was just cleaning. To her, it was listening to the metal, to the subtle resistance, to the quiet hum of possibility. Her grandfather had once told her that a weapon wasn't a weapon. Not really. It was a responsibility in steel. And he'd taught her, a 12-year-old with grease on her palms and wide, stubborn eyes, that if you couldn't respect it, you had no business touching it. That morning, Sarah wasn't thinking about who might one day fire this rifle or where. She was lost in her rhythm, the meditative cycle of disassemble, clean, inspect, reassemble. Alone, almost peaceful. Until she felt the shadow. It stretched over her workspace, breaking the perfect alignment of parts laid neatly on her cloth. Her shoulders tensed, but her hands didn't stop. She slid the bolt assembly forward, inspected the teeth, set it down carefully. Only then did she look up. The man standing there was impossible to ignore. Tall, silent, his uniform pressed and precise, bearing the insignia that made most men straighten their backs and measure their words. Navy SEAL commander. His dark eyes were locked on her hands, unblinking, evaluating. He didn't speak, not yet, and Sarah knew better than to fill the silence. Her pulse quickened, but she forced her hand steady. One more spring, one more inspection, not a word. Finally, he said it. His voice was low, calm, without the bark she expected from someone of his rank. You handle that weapon like you built it yourself. Sarah set the rod down, lifted her eyes to meet his. She didn't smile, didn't shrink, just answered the way her grandfather would have. Every weapon has its own personality. You have to understand what it needs to perform at its best. The commander studied her for a moment as though testing the weight of her words. Then he nodded, slowly, like she had passed something invisible. But there was something else in his eyes, not skepticism, not dismissal, curiosity. Sarah's throat tightened, though she hid it well. She had faced doubt her entire career, men who smirked, who second-guessed, who whispered she was too young, too small, too civilian. She had learned to let her work answer for her, let precision silence voices. But the way this man watched her was different. He wasn't here to disprove her. He was here because he already knew something. And she hated that it made her wonder what. The fluorescent light flickered, humming faintly above them, as though marking the shift in the air. "I've been watching you for 20 minutes, the commander said finally. His tone wasn't casual, it wasn't boastful, it was calculated. My team leader recommended you, said you're the best he's ever worked with. Sarah arched a brow, resuming her inspection of the trigger assembly. You don't strike me as the kind of man who takes recommendations lightly. I don't. He moved closer, not intruding, hands still clasped behind his back, respecting her space, her work, but near enough that she could feel the weight of his presence. There's something different about the way you work, he said. Most people approach a Barrett like it's dangerous, or like it's a tool they need to conquer. He tilted his head slightly, watching the way she aligned the pin with delicate precision. You treat it like a conversation. The words slipped under her defenses in a way she didn't expect. He saw it. He actually saw it. Sarah swallowed. She didn't want to admit that his insight struck deep, so she kept her voice even. My grandfather taught me weapons are tools. They're not good or bad. They're only as reliable as the person maintaining them. She set the piece down with a quiet click. Respect goes both ways. The commander's gaze didn't waver. If anything, it deepened. And Sarah felt a flicker of unease, not because she was intimidated, but because she sensed this wasn't just idle talk. He wasn't here for conversation. Exactly what I hoped you'd say. Her hands paused over the cloth. And why's that? For the first time, he allowed himself a small, unreadable smile. Because I have a proposition, one that goes beyond your current contract. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, suspenseful, and Sarah knew instinctively that nothing about this man, this conversation, or this morning would leave her life unchanged. Her heart picked up, though she kept her movements calm, inspecting the firing pin. I'm just a maintenance contractor, Commander. I clean rifles. I'm not military. That's exactly why you're perfect. The words dropped like stones into water, rippling through her composure. She finally set the parts down, meeting his eyes squarely. Perfect for what? He reached into his jacket, slow, deliberate, produced a tablet. With a fingerprint, the screen lit up and Sarah's breath caught. Not schematics she recognized, not standard documentation. Something else. Something that looked like it shouldn't exist. Lines, diagrams, modifications she had never seen. Suppression systems that bent the rules of physics. Modular designs that reimagined rifles into something more. What you're looking at, the commander said quietly, is 3 years of classified research. And I need someone who can do more than just understand it. I need someone who can make it work. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes tracing the impossibly detailed drawings. Her mind raced. Her hands itched to touch, to test, to prove. This wasn't cleaning rifles. This was rewriting them. Why me? She whispered. The commander's answer was simple, calm, final. Because you don't see limits, you see possibilities. For the first time in years, Sarah Martinez felt her world tilt. The choice that hovered wasn't about contracts or money or recognition. It was about becoming something more than she had ever imagined. And yet beneath the thrill, a deeper weight pressed against her chest. Because choices like this weren't reversible. Because stepping into his world meant leaving her own behind. Her grandfather's voice surfaced, low and steady in memory. The hardest decisions aren't between right and wrong. They're between two kinds of right. Sarah stared at the glowing tablet, the impossible schematics, the man who watched her with both intensity and expectation. And she wondered, would this be the decision that saved lives? Or the one that cost her everything? Why couldn't she decide? Sarah sat alone in her small apartment, the yellow glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the cluttered table. Before her lay the Barrett's cleaning kit, still half-packed from the day. She hadn't meant to bring it home, but somehow it felt wrong to leave it behind tonight. The familiar weight of the tools gave her something to anchor herself to. Her eyes moved to the yellow legal pad, columns scrawled in her neat, precise handwriting. Reasons to accept. Reasons to decline. Both columns stretched down the page, each line logical, rational, carefully considered. And yet the scales refused to tip. Her chest tightened with frustration. She was methodical by nature, steady, grounded in process. In her work, nothing was left to chance. But this wasn't about bolts and springs and tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. This was about stepping into a world she could barely see, a world that could devour her whole. She picked up her pen, added another line under decline, stability, family, predictability. Her hand lingered, predictability. The word felt heavy, comforting, but also suffocating. With a sharp exhale, she pushed the pen aside. Her phone rested on the edge of the table, the commander's card tucked neatly beneath it. One call would answer everything. One call would seal her future. She picked up the phone, dialed one digit, stopped. Her grandfather's voice rose from memory, the rasp of age wrapped in warmth. The hardest decisions aren't between right and wrong, Sarah. They're between two kinds of right. Her throat closed. She set the phone down again. The silence in the apartment grew unbearable. She rose, packing to the window. Outside, the city glowed in restless motion, car lights weaving through streets, neon signs flickering, lives unfolding in 1,000 small dramas. Somewhere out there, Commander Thompson and his SEALs were preparing, training, packing, steeling themselves for whatever impossible task lay ahead. And here she was, paralyzed. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Her reflection stared back, tired eyes, dark hair pulled into a messy braid, a woman who had built her reputation on precision, calm, certainty. Yet now, every certainty she'd ever leaned on was gone. A knot twisted in her stomach. What if I say yes? The answer unraveled in her mind. Contracts abandoned, clients confused, friends left in the dark. Her little brother still fumbling his way through college, left without the guidance he relied on. Her best friend Jennifer expecting her at a wedding in 6 months. All of it would crumble beneath secrecy and absence. And what if I say no? That answer twisted deeper. Missions delayed, soldiers waiting on weapons that could save them, families who might never see their sons or daughters again. Her hand went unconsciously to her chest, pressing against the ache there. She sat again at the table, staring at the list. Rational thought had carried her as far as it could, but this wasn't a rational choice anymore. Her eyes drifted to the small wooden box tucked on the shelf nearby. She rose, retrieved it, and placed it gently on the table. Its surface was scratched with age, worn smooth at the edges by decades of careful use. Her grandfather had given it to her when she turned 18, the day she'd taken apart her first rifle completely blindfolded, every spring and pin reassembled by memory alone. Inside lay his tools, the precision set he had carried through Vietnam, repaired countless weapons with, and finally passed to her. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted one. A small screwdriver, the handle polished by his hands long before it ever touched hers. "What would you do, Grandpa?" she whispered. No answer came, only silence broken by the faint hum of the refrigerator, yet somehow she could feel him, not in words but in presence, the quiet reminder of everything he had stood for. You don't choose the safe path because it's safe, Sarah. You choose the path that lets you use your gifts for something that matters. Her chest tightened, her eyes stinging as though smoke had filled the room. She closed them, clutching the tool, and let the words settle. When she opened them, the choice no longer felt distant. It felt inevitable. She picked up her phone. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, calm and alert even at this hour. Commander Thompson speaking. Her mouth went dry. For a heartbeat she couldn't find the words. Then steady she spoke. "This is Sarah Martinez. I've made my decision." The silence on the line was sharper than any blade. She could almost hear him hold his breath. "And what have you decided, Miss Martinez?" Sarah's pulse slowed. Her voice steadied, a calm she hadn't felt all night wrapping around her like armor. "I'm in." The words echoed in the small apartment, final and irreversible. On the other end, a long pause, then something new in his tone, relief, gratitude. "Outstanding. Transport leaves at 1900 hours tomorrow. Bring only essentials. Everything else will follow." Sarah nodded, though he couldn't see it. Understood. "Miss Martinez." His voice softened slightly, a rare break in formality. "You just agreed to help us change the rules of engagement. You just agreed to help us bring our people home." And then the line went dead. Sarah sat in the silence, the phone still warm against her ear. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage she would soon leave behind. She looked around, the books, the photographs, the familiar comforts of a life built carefully, piece by piece. Tomorrow it would all be gone. Her hand tightened around the old screwdriver. She whispered into the dim light, a promise to herself, to her grandfather, to the lives depending on her. "I won't let them down." The clock ticked on, marking the last night of her old life. By morning, Sarah Martinez would no longer be just a contractor. She would be something else. Something she had never dared imagine. How deep underground did they expect her to go? The transport rattled as it descended the narrow tunnel, the sound of reinforced tires echoing against concrete walls. Sarah sat in the back seat, her small duffel at her feet, the rest of her belongings left behind in an apartment that now belonged to another life. She had imagined military bases before, but this wasn't a base. This was something buried out of sight, sealed away from the world above. No windows, no landmarks, just walls that pressed closer the deeper they went, until daylight felt like a dream she wasn't sure she had ever lived. The driver said nothing. The guard beside her said nothing. And Sarah, gripping the strap of her bag, felt silence swallow her whole. When the vehicle finally stopped, steel doors loomed ahead. They hissed open with mechanical precision, and the smell of ozone and cold air spilled inside. "Out," the guard said, his tone flat but not unkind. Sarah stepped out, her boots striking the polished floor. The doors sealed shut behind her, the sound echoing like the final click of a lock. This was it, no going back. A young officer approached, his face composed, eyes hidden behind the formality of rank. "Miss Martinez, this way." She followed him down a corridor that looked like something from a science fiction film. White walls, cameras recessed into the ceiling, lights glowing without flicker. Each turn revealed more of the same, sterile and endless, as though designed to erase the sense of time or direction. Her chest tightened with unease. She had always valued control, precision, awareness of her environment. Here, everything was hidden, dictated, decided without her input. She was being swallowed whole by a system she couldn't yet read. Finally, the officer stopped before a reinforced door, tapped a code, and stepped aside. "Commander Thompson is waiting for you inside." Sarah nodded, steadying her breath, and stepped through. The room was smaller than she expected. A briefing space, but not ostentatious. One table, two chairs, a tablet resting in the center. The walls were bare except for a single screen recessed into the far side, displaying only the seal of the Department of Defense. Commander Thompson stood waiting, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her the moment she entered. His presence filled the room more than the furniture, more than the sterile walls. "Miss Martinez," his voice carried both welcome and weight, "glad you decided to join us." Sarah set her bag down quietly by the door. "I said I would." A small smile flickered across his face, the same unreadable one she had seen in the armory. "And so you did." He gestured to the chair. She sat back straight, trying to ignore the tension twisting at the base of her neck. For a long moment the commander said nothing, just studied her. It wasn't unkind. It wasn't even intimidating. It was deliberate, like he was waiting for her to reveal something without words. Finally, he spoke. "You understand the gravity of what you've agreed to." Sarah's fingers brushed the edge of the table. "I understand that I don't understand everything yet, but I know it won't be small." That seemed to satisfy him. He reached for the tablet, activated the screen, and slid it across to her. Schematics, again, but these weren't the same as before. These were layered, annotated, filled with codes and security tags that spoke to years of classified development. "You'll see things here that don't officially exist," he said. "Not in any manual, not in any program you've ever touched. What you do with them will affect whether my team comes home." Sarah leaned closer, scanning the diagrams. Suppression systems integrated into barrels. Ammunition designed for variable velocity. Targeting modules that used sensors she didn't recognize. Her mind itched with questions, but one stood above the rest. "Why me, Commander?" She looked up, her voice quiet but insistent. "I asked you before, and I'm asking again. Why not one of your specialists?" He studied her in silence, then finally leaned forward. Because specialists follow rules, you don't. The words hit harder than she expected. Her chest tightened, the old doubts flickering back, the years of proving herself, the whispers she ignored, the steady climb against walls built higher for her than for anyone else. And now, this man, this commander, was asking her to step beyond the very walls she had fought to master. The weight of it pressed down, and for the first time since she had said yes, Sarah wondered if she had made a mistake. She masked it, of course. She always did, but something in the commander's eyes told her he saw it anyway. "You're wondering if you belong here," he said softly. Sarah's throat caught. She didn't answer. "That's good." He leaned back, voice firm again. "The ones who don't question themselves are the ones who get people killed." The screen on the wall flickered suddenly. Video filled the space, grainy drone footage of a convoy ambushed in a barren landscape. Small figures moved, weapons flaring, vehicles igniting in fire. Sarah's stomach turned. She had seen images before, of course. News reports, footage, but this wasn't a report. This was raw, unfiltered. Real soldiers, real seconds from death. The commander's voice broke through. "This is why you're here. Standard weapons, standard tactics, and a smart enemy who knows how to counter both. They knew our ranges, our patterns, our limits, and they exploited them." The footage ended. Silence filled the room again. Sarah's eyes lingered on the blank screen. For the first time, the schematics on the tablet didn't feel abstract. They felt urgent. She whispered almost to herself, "They didn't stand a chance." "No," the commander agreed. "They didn't, but with what you can build." He let the sentence hang unfinished. Sarah forced herself to look away from the screen, back to the tablet. Her pulse quickened as she traced the designs with her eyes. Each line felt heavier now, less like engineering and more like life and death. Her mind began to race, solving pieces, imagining integrations, pathways she hadn't seen before. The thrill of it, the possibility, sparked inside her. But then another thought cut through. If I fail, they die. The thrill dimmed, replaced by a cold knot in her chest. The commander seemed to sense it. He didn't push, didn't try to fill the silence. He just let her sit with it. Finally, Sarah exhaled, steady but low. "What exactly do you need me to do first?" A shadow of a smile returned to his face. "That's the right question." He rose, motioning for her to follow. She did, gripping her bag as though it were a lifeline. The door opened into another corridor. This one was different, not sterile, not blank. Behind glass walls, workshops buzzed with life. Engineers hunched over consoles, machines cut metal with precision, sparks danced in showers as welders fused steel to design. The air vibrated with focus, with urgency. Sarah slowed as she walked, her eyes catching every detail. Modular frames laid out like puzzles. Testing chambers humming with data streams. A rifle on one bench that looked like a cousin to the Barrett, yet different, sharper, stranger, as though someone had dreamt of its future and tried to drag it back into the present. Her chest rose, tight with awe. This was beyond anything she had imagined. And yet, every step deeper pressed the weight harder onto her shoulders. The commander's voice broke the hum around them. "This is your new world, Miss Martinez. Innovation under fire, precision without precedent. You'll have 8 weeks to solve problems that have killed better men than me." He stopped, turning to face her. His expression was no longer testing. It was something else. Something that looked like trust, sharpened by desperation. "Welcome to the program." Sarah swallowed hard, gripping the strap of her bag tighter. And for the first time since she had said yes, she truly understood what that yes meant. Why were they staring at her like she didn't belong? The workshop buzzed with low voices, machinery humming, computers flashing with endless streams of data. Sarah stood in the doorway, clutching a folder of schematics the commander had handed her that morning. Inside the glass-walled room, 4 engineers worked at separate benches, each surrounded by tools and unfinished weapons. When she stepped in, the voices dipped. Not hostile, not openly dismissive, but heavy enough to notice. She placed the folder on the central table, forcing her voice steady. "I'm Sarah Martinez. Commander Thompson brought me into—" "We know who you are," one of them interrupted. A tall man with graying hair and sharp glasses. His badge read Dr. Collins, Senior Systems Engineer. His tone was clipped, polite enough to avoid insubordination, but every word laced with doubt. Sarah kept her chin level. "Then you know why I'm here." Collins gave a thin smile. "That's what we're trying to figure out." A ripple of tension passed through the others. Two younger engineers avoided her gaze, focusing back on their screens. The fourth, a woman in her 40s with hair pulled back tight, just folded her arms and watched silently. Sarah opened the folder. Schematics spilled out lines of impossible designs, half-realized innovations that seemed more like blueprints for a future century than for the present moment. She spread them carefully across the table. "This is the problem set Commander Thompson asked me to start with," she said. "The suppression system integrated with muzzle flash elimination and electronic jamming." Collins raised a brow. "You're aware 3 teams have already tried. Each one failed." "I read the reports," Sarah said, meeting his stare. "And you think you can do better?" It wasn't an honest question. It was a test, the same kind she had faced 100 times before in smaller rooms, smaller worlds. She answered the only way she knew how. "I don't think I'll try, and I'll find out." Silence followed. Collins smirked faintly, turned back to his bench, and muttered something under his breath about optimism. Sarah ignored it. She had long ago learned that proving herself wasn't done with words. It was done with work. She spent the next 6 hours buried in the schematics. The lines blurred, reformed, unraveled in her mind. The theory was sound, suppressing sound waves, redirecting flash, integrating jamming frequencies into a compact unit. But theory had a way of betraying you when steel and sweat entered the picture. By hour 7, her neck ached, her eyes burned, and doubt clawed at her chest. Maybe they're right. Maybe this isn't possible. She shut her eyes, pressing her palms flat against the table. She could almost hear her grandfather's voice. "Metal doesn't lie. If it fails, you missed something. Look again." Sarah opened her eyes, leaned closer. Not at the big picture, at the details. The material stresses, the flow of heat along the barrel, the tolerances too fine for the naked eye. And then she saw it. A pattern buried in the data. Every failed prototype had tried to force 3 systems into one housing. What if instead of one housing, she staggered them? A layered integration, each part carrying its own stress but working in sequence rather than simultaneously. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't neat, but it might just work. She grabbed a pencil, began sketching modifications directly over the schematic. Lines cut across lines, notes scribbled into margins. Hours melted away as she traced possibility into form. By midnight, her hands were blackened with graphite, her shoulders screaming. But in front of her lay something new, something that hadn't existed when the day began. A layered suppression system, crude in concept but achievable. She looked up. Collins stood across the table, watching. She hadn't heard him approach. His eyes flicked over her sketches, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Sarah braced for the dismissive remark, the smirk. But it didn't come. Instead, he said quietly, "That might actually work." The words struck harder than praise, because they weren't given easily. Sarah exhaled slowly, her chest loosening for the first time all day. But Collins wasn't done. "You'll need prototype materials, precision machining, tolerances within 5 microns. You're asking for miracles." Sarah met his gaze. "Then let's start." For the next week, the workshop became her battlefield. The engineers didn't welcome her at first, but they couldn't deny her persistence. Day after day, she pushed, sketching, testing, failing, trying again. Failure came often, parts overheated, Circuits fried. One prototype collapsed after a single test fire, fragments scattering across the bench. Each time, doubt flared not just from the others but inside her own chest. But she refused to walk away. Every failure was a message, and she listened, adjusted, tried again. By the fifth night, she had stopped sleeping. Her hands trembled from exhaustion, her eyes bloodshot, but the prototype on her bench was whole. Layered suppression, carefully aligned. Compact enough to attach, light enough to carry. The others gathered as she mounted it onto the modified Barrett. Collins stood with arms crossed, skeptical still, but watching closer now. Sarah steadied herself. Her finger brushed the trigger. The room held its breath. She fired. The shot cracked but softer, muted, the thunder reduced to something that whispered power instead of screaming it. No flash, no echo, just controlled precision. The engineers exchanged looks. Collins's brows rose. Sarah lowered the weapon, her hands trembling. Relief surged, followed by something deeper, pride. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it worked. And in that moment, for the first time since stepping into the facility, Sarah felt like she belonged. She turned, and there he was. Commander Thompson stood behind the glass, watching silently, his face unreadable. But as their eyes met, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Approval, trust. Sarah's throat tightened. Because it wasn't just about schematics anymore. It was about lives, about whether the soldiers in that grainy footage or the ones who would follow would come home. And now, for the first time, she believed she could help make sure they did. Why did her hands feel colder than the steel in front of her? Sarah stood at the edge of the firing range, her fingers clasped tight behind her back. Beyond the reinforced glass, a Navy SEAL team prepped their gear with casual precision, their movements sharp and unhesitating. Every buckle clicked, every rifle checked. They moved like a single organism, honed by years of training and scars she could only imagine. Her prototype rested in their hands now. The layered suppression system she had bled hours into, the one she had nearly abandoned after too many failures. A device born in sleepless nights and doubt, held now by men who trusted nothing they hadn't proven themselves. And that was the truth that made her stomach twist. They didn't trust her, not yet. The SEAL closest to the firing lane gave the weapon an almost dismissive glance, then muttered something Sarah couldn't hear. Laughter rippled through the team, not cruel, not loud, but sharp enough to cut. Sarah's jaw clenched. She had felt this before. The quiet dismissal, the unspoken "what is she doing here?" Commander Thompson stepped beside her, his eyes fixed on the team. His presence steadied the room, as though every man in that bay moved because he willed it. "You nervous?" he asked, low enough for only her to hear. Sarah kept her gaze forward. "Should I be?" His lips twitched, the closest thing to a smile. "Depends. Do you believe in your work?" Her throat tightened. "I want to." He gave a small nod. "Good. Wanting it means you care, but belief comes after you see it survive fire." The team moved into position. Her rifle mounted on its bipod, its suppressor glinting under fluorescent light. Targets lined the range. Metal silhouettes, mock enemy stations, communication towers wired to detect interference. A soldier, tall, broad, eyes sharp with practiced skepticism, knelt behind the weapon. His voice cut across the bay. "Looks heavy." "Try it," Thompson called back, his tone calm but final. The soldier didn't argue. He just leaned in, finger brushing the trigger. The range went still. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. What if it fails? What if it ruptures? What if I miss something and it costs him? The shot cracked. But it wasn't a crack. It was a muted punch, low and sharp, swallowed into silence. No echo, no flash, just the faint hiss of air where thunder should have been. The soldier froze, eyes wide. He looked up, disbelief flashing across his face. Another shot, the same, controlled, quiet, perfect. And then the monitors blinked. The enemy comms simulation spiked into static. The jamming had activated, interfering with signals across the range. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to breathe. The soldier fired again. Again. The rifle hummed with precision, not fury. The silence that followed each shot felt heavier than any explosion. "Clear comms check," another SEAL called, tapping his headset. "Nothing, they're blind." A ripple of surprise moved through the team. And Sarah's chest swelled. Until it happened. On the fifth shot, the weapon jammed. A small sound, a mechanical hiccup, but sharp enough to slice through her pride. The soldier cursed under his breath, slapping the side of the receiver. Her stomach dropped. Failure. The soldier cleared it, chambered another round, fired. The shot landed, but the rhythm was broken. The doubt had crept back in. Sarah pressed her palms against the glass, fighting the urge to run inside, to explain, to fix. Thompson didn't move. His voice stayed calm. "They're not looking for perfection, Martinez. They're looking for survival." But Sarah shook her head, her throat tight. If it fails in the field, they don't get another chance. The test continued. 10 rounds, 15, each fired with muted precision. The jam didn't repeat, but its shadow lingered. The SEALs whispered to each other, glancing back at the glass where Sarah stood. When the session ended, the soldier carrying the rifle approached the observation room. He stepped inside, weapon slung across his chest. Sweat clung to his forehead, his jaw tight. He stopped in front of Sarah, studying her. Then, without a word, he held the rifle out. She took it. His eyes narrowed. "It's good, better than I expected, but if you want me to trust my life to it," he leaned in, voice low, sharp. "It can't jam, not once, not ever." Sarah's chest ached. She nodded, gripping the weapon like it was more than steel, like it was the weight of his words. When he left, Thompson finally spoke. "You hear that?" Sarah swallowed hard, every syllable. "Good." He stepped closer, his voice softer now. "That's the sound of responsibility, not rejection. He didn't dismiss you. He challenged you." Her eyes burned. The soldier's words weren't cruelty. They were truth, brutal truth, the kind she had been raised to face. And with that truth came clarity. She turned the weapon in her hands, examining every line, every joint. Her mind already raced through possibilities, redesigning, reinforcing, eliminating the weakness that had betrayed her in front of them all. "I'll fix it," she whispered. Thompson's gaze stayed on her, steady and certain. "I know you will." That night, Sarah stayed in the workshop long after the others had gone. The silence pressed heavy, the hum of machines her only companion. She stripped the prototype down piece by piece, every part laid bare under her hands. She found the flaw, a tolerance too tight, a spring too stiff, small, invisible to anyone who wasn't listening closely enough. But she listened. She always listened. By dawn, her hands were raw, her eyes bloodshot, but the rifle was whole again. Stronger, cleaner, better. She wiped the sweat from her brow, exhaustion pulling at every muscle, but pride anchoring her upright. Because tomorrow, when they fired it again, it wouldn't jam. Not once. Not ever. Why did silence feel heavier than gunfire? Sarah sat alone in the dim-lit workshop, her hands folded over a mug of untouched coffee gone cold hours ago. On the bench before her lay the modified Barrett, her Barrett now, stripped down to its core. She had polished every component twice, rechecked every tolerance, though the rifle in her workshop wasn't the one that mattered. The one that mattered was 3,000 miles away, in the hands of men she had never met, moving through an operation she wasn't allowed to know in detail. All she knew was this: her weapon was in the field. And if it failed? She closed her eyes, gripping the mug until her knuckles ached. The workshop door opened. Heavy boots crossed the floor, slow, deliberate. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. "Can't sleep," Commander Thompson's voice was softer than usual, not sharp with command, just human. Sarah exhaled, shaking her head. How can I, knowing what's happening out there? He moved closer, stopping just short of her bench. You did your part, now it's theirs. Her eyes flicked up to his, searching. And if my part wasn't enough? For a moment his face was unreadable. Then he leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. Do you know what the hardest thing in command is? He asked. She shook her head. Knowing men will die. No matter how perfect your plan, how careful your preparation, some won't come home. His eyes locked on hers, steady, unblinking. What matters is whether you gave them a chance. His words settled heavy in the room. Not comfort, not absolution, just truth. Sarah swallowed, her throat tight. And what if my mistake cost them that chance? Thompson studied her. For a moment, the mask of commander fell, and she saw something else, something raw. It already has, he said quietly. Her breath caught. He didn't look away. I've buried men because equipment failed. A jammed rifle, a cracked scope, a vehicle that wouldn't start when the ambush came. His jaw tightened, the memory sharp in his voice. That's why I came to you, because I'm done burying men for problems we can fix. Sarah's chest ached. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was full of ghosts. His, hers, all the weight of lives carried in steel and design. Before she could answer, the comms panel on the wall blinked. A tone filled the room, coded, sharp, urgent. Thompson moved to it quickly, entering his credentials. Sarah rose from her chair, every nerve on fire. The screen lit up with a secure feed. A face appeared. One of the SEALs from the team, his skin streaked with dirt, his voice low and taut. Mission Phase 1 complete. Suppressor system worked. We were inside 50 meters. Enemy didn't hear a thing. Sarah's breath rushed out, her knees weak. The SEAL continued. Electronic jamming cut their comms cold. They never got a call out. We neutralized all targets without a single alert. Her eyes burned. Relief flooded her chest, sharp and overwhelming. But then his voice shifted, the weight in it pulling her back. We had one malfunction. Brief jam on shot 6. Cleared in 2 seconds, but it could have been worse if the timing was bad. Sarah's stomach dropped, even here, even now. The SEAL leaned closer, his voice softer. But listen, I've been in this game a long time. I've never seen anything like this system. It saved our asses tonight. Tell her. He hesitated, then nodded toward the screen. Tell Martinez she did good. The feed cut, silence returned. Sarah stood frozen, her breath uneven. The words should have been victory. They were victory. Lives saved. Mission complete. Proof that her work mattered. But all she heard was the failure. Brief jam on shot 6. Her hands trembled. She pressed them against the bench, steadying herself. Thompson turned, studying her. You're thinking about the jam, aren't you? She nodded, couldn't hide it. If it had been worse. He stepped closer, his voice low, grounding. It was, and do you know why? She shook her head. Because you were already listening. Because you saw the weakness before they carried it into the field. You fixed most of it and the rest you'll fix next. That's how this works. Not by being perfect, by being relentless. His words struck deep. Relentless. Her grandfather's voice echoed in memory. Metal doesn't lie. Look again. Her chest loosened just slightly. She looked down at the rifle on her bench, the one still gleaming under the fluorescent light, still waiting for her hands. I'll fix it, she whispered. I'll fix it until it never fails them again. Thompson's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. For the first time, his voice carried something warmer. I believe you will. He started to leave, then paused at the door. Get some rest, Martinez. Tomorrow we start the next challenge, and it's bigger than this one. The door shut. Sarah stood alone again, the silence heavy but different now. Not suffocating, not hopeless. Just waiting. She sat, pulling the rifle closer, her hands steady once more. The mission had proven one thing beyond doubt. This wasn't about prototypes anymore. This was about lives. And she wasn't going to stop until every life she could save came home. How do you build a weapon that kills without destroying? Sarah stared at the schematics on the table, her heart hammering as though each line of code and steel carried its own pulse. For weeks she had lived inside this underground facility, but this challenge, this was different. Commander Thompson had handed her the tablet only hours earlier. The words still echoed. Urban environment, close quarters, collateral risk unacceptable, 8 weeks to prototype, 12 for field deployment. 8 weeks to do the impossible. She dragged her hands down her face, the fluorescent lights above burning into her tired eyes. The design specs weren't just ambitious. They were contradictions. A rifle that could neutralize threats in a room without penetrating walls into the next. Ammunition precise enough to collapse inside a target but not beyond. A firing system that could adapt shot by shot. Her mind spun. Physics didn't bend that way, at least not easily. She pushed the tablet aside, staring at her grandfather's old screwdriver resting on the bench. Its handle was worn smooth, the steel tip dulled but still true. She lifted it, feeling the familiar weight. "You don't choose the easy problems," she whispered, repeating his old words. "You choose the ones that matter." But the weight of this problem was crushing. The door opened. Thompson entered, silent as always. His gaze flicked over the chaos on her bench, sketches, failed prototypes, discarded casings. "How's it look?" he asked. Sarah barked a humorless laugh. "Like you asked me to invent gravity in reverse." His lips twitched faintly, but his eyes stayed steady. "So you'll do it." She glared at him. "Do you ever doubt anything?" "Every day," he said quietly. "I just don't let it stop me." Her chest tightened. She wanted to snap back, to tell him this wasn't just about confidence. This was science. This was blood and steel and math that didn't care about courage. But instead, she looked back at the schematics, her throat dry. "If I fail," she whispered, "it won't just be soldiers who pay. It'll be children, families, people who don't even know we're here." Thompson stepped closer, his voice softer. "That's why you can't fail." The words landed like a blade. Not cruel, not impossible, just fact. Sarah turned back to her bench, jaw clenched. For the next week, she drowned in work. Every waking hour, and there were too many, since she barely slept, she pushed deeper. She tested polymers that could fragment on impact. She experimented with smart materials that changed density mid-flight. She coded algorithms that adjusted velocity the instant a round left the barrel. And she failed. Again and again. Bullets that shattered too soon, barrels that warped from heat, systems that jammed after 3 rounds. By the 4th night, her hands were raw, her eyes ringed black. Her chest ached from too much coffee, too little rest. Collins, the senior engineer, approached her bench, watching her test another shattered prototype. "You're burning yourself out," he said flatly. Sarah shook her head. "Not until it works." He sighed, but there was no dismissal in it this time, only reluctant respect. "You remind me of myself 30 years ago." She looked up, startled. "Difference is," he said, "I didn't have soldiers waiting on me. You do." The truth sank deeper. She turned back to her sketches, her pencil scratching furiously. By week 2, she found it. Not perfection, not yet, but the seed of possibility. A layered projectile, a hardened shell that collapsed inward on impact, dispersing controlled energy without overpenetration. Her hands shook as she tested it in the simulation chamber. The round fired clean, silent under suppression. It hit the target, a steel plate, and shattered inside, leaving only a shallow dent on the far side. She exhaled, dizzy with relief. "Again," she whispered. Again it fired, again it collapsed, controlled, precise. Tears blurred her vision. It wasn't done. It wasn't field ready, but it was real. Thompson appeared behind her, as if summoned by the sound. He studied the target, then her. "You did it," he said simply. She shook her head. "Not yet, but I found the door." He gave a single nod, then walked through it. For the next 6 weeks, Sarah lived inside that door, refining, testing, pushing the round into reliability. She collapsed at her bench more than once, woken by the sound of machinery or Thompson's hand on her shoulder. Sometimes he said nothing, just left coffee beside her. Other times his words cut through exhaustion. "You're closer than you think. Failure is just data, use it. They don't need perfect, they need better than the enemy expects." The bond between them grew in silence more than words. He watched her fall and he watched her rise, and she began to understand. His trust wasn't casual, it was survival. On the 7th week's final day, she stood in the chamber again. The weapon in her hands wasn't the Barrett anymore. It was something new, shorter, modular, with a firing system built for adaptability. She fired. The round struck the target, collapsed inside. The wall behind it remained untouched. Again, 20 rounds flawless. Sarah lowered the weapon, her body trembling, her throat raw with something between a sob and a laugh. Collins whispered behind her, awe breaking through his skepticism. "You just changed the game." She turned, meeting Thompson's eyes through the glass. For the first time he smiled fully. Not small, not hidden, real. And Sarah, exhausted, broken, alive, allowed herself to believe she had done the impossible. But even as pride swelled, a shadow followed. Because she knew what came next. This weapon wouldn't live in theory. It would live in blood. Why did every second feel like a lifetime? The operations center hummed with tension. Banks of screens glowed against dim light, voices murmured low, coded, clipped. Sarah sat rigid at the edge of the room, her hands clenched so tight her nails dug into her palms. Before her, the live feed streamed in grainy night vision. 6 SEALs, moving silent through a shattered city. They carried her weapon now, not the old Barrett, not the prototype, the new one, the impossible one she had forced into being through sleepless nights and trembling hands. Every muzzle flash muted, every shot precise. Her heart thundered against her ribs. Thompson stood beside her, arms folded, gaze fixed on the screen. His presence was steady, unshaken, but Sarah could feel the current running beneath it. He cared more than he'd ever say aloud. The team moved street by street. The city looked like a graveyard, walls scarred with shell fire, windows hollow, silence broken only by distant echoes. Civilians huddled in basements, unaware of the men moving above to keep death from their doors. Sarah's chest tightened. This wasn't theory anymore. This wasn't steel and graphite and lab reports. These were men breathing, risking, surviving because of what her hands had built. A shot cracked, soft, controlled, a hostile dropped, no alarm. Another precise, contained, no penetration beyond the room. Sarah leaned closer, breath caught, it works. Again, silent, surgical, untraceable. The team's comms crackled through the room. Moving to phase 2, civilians intact, no collateral. Applause whispered through the ops center, relief, pride. But Sarah didn't exhale, not yet. Because she knew better, missions never ended clean. And then it came. A figure darted from the shadows, an enemy with a launcher on his shoulder. The feed jolted, voices cursed through comms. One shot too late. The explosion lit the street. Dust clouded the feed, static tore across the screens. Sarah's body lurched forward, her throat closed. No, not now, not after all of this. The image returned, smoke, fire, shouts. And then the impossible weapon spoke. Silent, sharp, precise. The hostile dropped. The feed steadied. Voices came back, ragged but alive. "We're good. Repeat, we're good. Minor injuries, continuing mission." Sarah collapsed back in her chair, her body shaking, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. She had never prayed before, not really, but now in that moment she whispered into the silence of her own chest, "Bring them home." Minutes crawled like hours, the mission pressed deeper, more targets, more threats, and each time the weapon answered, clean, precise. Until the final words crackled through. Objective secured, all friendlies intact, no civilian casualties, mission complete. The room erupted, voices breaking, fists pounding tables, restrained celebration laced with exhausted relief. Sarah sat still, frozen. Her body trembled with something beyond pride, beyond exhaustion, a weight she couldn't name pressed against her chest. Thompson turned. For once his mask was gone. His eyes burned with something raw, gratitude, relief, something he couldn't say aloud in this room. He leaned close, his voice just for her. "You brought them home." Her throat broke, she couldn't answer. She just nodded, eyes wet, hands trembling. Later, when the room cleared, Sarah walked alone through the quiet corridors. The adrenaline had drained, leaving her hollow, heavy. She entered the workshop, her sanctuary, her battlefield. The tools lay scattered, the schematics pinned, the scent of oil and steel thick in the air. She sank into her chair, her grandfather's screwdriver resting in her palm. For hours she sat in silence, until Thompson entered, stepping softly, almost respectfully. He didn't speak at first, just stood watching her. Finally she looked up, her voice cracked. It worked, but it almost didn't. He nodded. "That's combat. Nothing ever goes exactly right." Her hands tightened around the screwdriver. "What if next time it doesn't save them? What if I fail?" He stepped closer, his voice low, steady. "Then you try again, because that's what this work is, not perfection, relentlessness." Her chest ached. Tears finally fell, quiet, unguarded. He didn't move closer, didn't touch, didn't intrude. He just stood beside her, steady as always, letting her break without judgment. And in that silence, Sarah understood. This wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't about recognition or contracts or proving she belonged. It was about men walking out of ruins alive, about families not getting phone calls in the night, about dignity that never asked for applause, only demanded she keep going. She wiped her face, set the screwdriver down, and whispered to the empty room, to her grandfather, to herself, "I won't stop." And she meant it. Because sometimes dignity doesn't shout, it doesn't beg. It simply acts.